Anyway, so this intro is a little bit premature, but I'm trying something new for the next video. Uh, I'm trying to have it done up until the end of the forest, which is right before chapter 4. So I guess the completion of chapter 3. But it is taking a while. It's taking a minute. So we'll see. Yeah, that should be this video.
Chapter 1. Cassandra's bed has a humble wooden frame, made from the soft brown wood of the outer forest. She lay deep in slumber, her body adorned with a threadbare quilt she had stitched together from old fabric scraps. Despite its worn appearance, the bedding was perfectly warm and comforting, cocooning her in a swath of faded colors. A rickety wooden bookshelf stood against one wall, its shelves mostly empty except for a bit of dust, a few cobwebs, and a bowl which contained the remains of a fat little fish with no name. It had died yesterday, though its passing won't be of any great concern. It had lived a good life, and died with a full stomach. Why, it would still have had children, had it not eaten them as they were born. Tomorrow, she will take it out into the forest and offer it to the beetles as a show of thanks. A tiny gesture, considering the fact that she will ignore their warnings. The room would be an uncomfortable space, were Cassandra a bit older and a few inches taller. It was certainly small, with no space for even a window. On the opposite side of the room was a wooden desk, covered in ink stains and surrounded by scattered parchment. Her handwriting skills would never be considered an art form, but with time and a little patience with herself, she could both read and write. To be sure, there were words she does not know, nor would she recognize, but for a 9-year-old she would be seen as clever, if not above average, for never having any formal education. The floor was a mix of perfectly even tan wooden planks and a worn-out rug that had seen better days. It was the one thing in her room that she would always keep clean, as her father had once exploded into anger when he found it caked with mud. She wasn't one to neglect her responsibilities, however the night before had been difficult and she went to sleep as soon as she got to her room. She had left a trail of mud leading from the front door, and her bed sheets would take hours to clean, but that old rug seemed to be the only thing that bothered anyone. Her mother, Catherine, would often step in should Weslow become aggressive, but this time she just stayed quiet. It was her way of agreeing with him, and she hated it, but she knew it must have been important to the both of them. It was a simple mistake that ended with more than she cared to go through, so for everyone's sake, it was kept spotless. The pattern of intricate designs were long faded from years of use, but the overall color reminded her of bright red tomatoes, which had been on her shit list since before she could remember. Cassandra groans and turns over in bed. She can hear the sound of glass shattering and yelling through the heavy wood of the walls, but it had become common to her unconscious state, as something most usual within the house. Like the cracking of logs over a fire in winter or the sound of the rain crashing upon her small cottage in the woods, it was not enough to pull her out of her dreams. As far as she was concerned, the earliest moments of the morning centered on having a bear for a pet. It seemed her parents were away, and even though it was very small, she ran about the cottage, overturning furniture and altogether, overreacting. Before the screams of the next room could register with her, Cassandra's thoughts were of how silly she was behaving towards a very friendly little bear. It was a foolish representation of herself, and she found herself immediately annoyed. But the space around her melts away as, finally, the real world begins to sink in. She can hear her father yelling unrecognizable words, and her mother, screaming. Cassandra throws off the layers of patchwork that make up her sheets and runs towards the adjacent room, but her parents' door is shut. Even at the age of 9, she knows she could never move it an inch. The wood was different from most because it was almost as hard as stone. But still, the house shook as her father raged against whatever drunken irritation possessed him today. Catherine would often pull Weslow away in these moments, giving Cassandra time to go elsewhere of her own accord. The heavy doors became the armor her mother used to protect her until he eventually calms. But today, Cassandra has had enough. She pounds her small fist against the door and screams for Catherine, who can be heard sobbing. Time dragged on as Weslow slowly opened the door, but before she could spot her mother through the upturned furniture, fallen books and smashed artwork, Weslow pushes her to the ground. The look on his face took the fight out of Cassandra, and her voice caught in her throat. His rage seemed so out of control that his red and watery eyes reflected the smoldering embers of the fire that had lit the living room. "Get out," he says coldly, his tone flat and emotionless. Pulling her by the collar of her shirt, he opens the front door, and tosses her out like a disobedient pet, onto the cold and dry morning dirt. A small gathering of debris broke the worst of her landing, but she still fell hard and rolled side over side for several meters. Cassandra picked herself up, her knees scraped and her heart pounding in her chest. With a grimace plastered across her face, she dusted herself off as best she could. The cold dry dust would work well enough to stop the tiny spots of blood that began to pool over the broken skin of her knees. Unlike a certain friend of hers, she had no skill for the tricks that could cast off dirt, or how to tell directions with nothing but a feather. Or even the skills of her friend Yeslin, who was slow to learn most things, but excelled at mixing herbs. The sort that could accelerate the rate at which small wounds heal, would be a useful one to pick up, and she reminds herself to ask about it when she sees her next. The sky was a dull, ashen gray, which cast its gloom over the clearing around her home. The weather perfectly complemented her mood, and she found herself feeling thankful the rains had passed by the time she made her grand arrival out into the world. No more than a few patches of grass grew so close to her house, and so Cassandra liked to think that her father poisoned the very ground with his presence. She looks up to her home, its dark blue wooden walls standing tall and imposing, while she could do nothing but shake her head to clear her thoughts. Today was just another addition to the list of crappy starts to what is usually a pretty good day. The sounds of earthenware containers shattering and furniture being destroyed was going to continue, but the house would never let the sounds escape. She had seen little in that brief moment through the open door, but it had told her everything she needed to know. Cassandra's small fists trembled with anger as she thought of her mother trapped in that kind of tempest. Weslow's face, contorted with fury, was etched into her memory. But her mother would endure, as long as Cassandra left and stayed out of the way. She knows he couldn't hurt her if she stood up to him. Her friends have told her all about the way he gets. He stumbles into town, already reeking of alcohol, then continues from bar to bar until he starts a fight, eventually getting beaten and thrown into one of the hundreds of alleyways. Possibly, the only positive thing anyone's ever said about him was that he somehow managed to live so long, but Cassandra was not convinced anyone ever meant it as a good thing. Long stacks of blue logs made up her home, with wood that was impossible to harvest unless naturally fallen. While en route they would be as hard as stone. Nearly as hard as stone, meant that getting back inside would never work. It left a sickening feeling in her stomach, but if she remained inside she would only risk getting the worst of Weslow's anger. She walks to the back of her home, her bare feet atop the cold-packed earth sending shivers up her spine. But fortunately or not, this wasn't the first morning of its kind, and Cassandra was ready. There were never any sounds this close to her home. The massive trees prevented any substantial breeze from passing through, and the animals seemed to avoid the large clearing of their property. No birds with their morning song ever greeted Cassandra's arrival, but at the least, there would be plenty once she got closer to the forest. After moving a few carefully placed stones, she gathers a small pack of clothes from a box, wrapped in a brown scrap of fabric, and removes a small blue knife, found several weeks ago as she traveled through the forest. She stares at it darkly, and remembers her mother making her swear to never harm Weslow, even though she thinks it would be pretty easy to catch him unaware to end both their problems at once. She made the promise with blood, but it was what it took for Cassandra to begin her training, and she would never betray her mother's trust. The tiny scar on her thumb reminded her of that much. But still, you grow stronger every day, Catherine would say, and Cassandra knew it wouldn't be long before she would put a stop to her father's nonsense. Deciding to focus on getting through the forest, she takes the knife and cuts a strip of cloth from her pack. She takes a few small blue leaves and wraps them around the wooden blade, their leathery toughness making them a suitable sheath. She had to use every resource available to her, and so her clothes were also made from the forest leaves. Layers of them sewn together and treated in oils would retain their soft and supple nature, and a simple tunic design allowed her plenty of mobility. After pulling the clothes over top of her nightgown, she uses the strip to tie the bundled-up knife, just below her knee, before setting out into the forest. The cool morning air wrapped around her, casting off any remaining haze from having woken up no more than a few minutes ago. The sky above was a tapestry of thin gray clouds, moving slowly as the rising sun peeked out over the horizon. It was going to rain again, but for now the crisp earthy smell was something to enjoy. Once she gets to the city, it would be very different. Chapter 2. The forest always seemed welcoming to her. The massive leaves above provided few patches of dappled sunlight, yet still it danced upon the forest floor, illuminating vibrant mosses and wildflowers that painted the landscape in a riot of colors. With each step deeper into the woods, Cassandra's senses heightened. She could feel the coolness of the forest floor beneath her feet and let out a small shiver. Her shoes were made of the leaves of the forest, tough, thin, light, supple, and waterproof, but at the sacrifice of warmth. She decided that she would set out for a run to warm up, and Cassandra takes off into a steady, though cautious jog. The softness of the moss clung to the tiny hairs of the fior leaves that cushioned her soles, but it also helped keep her steps silent. The occasional rustle of leaves, as unseen creatures scurried away, helped set her mind to task. She had learned to navigate the blue forest, modifying her path each time to evade the creatures that called this forest home. The forest floor bore evidence of their presence, tiny paw prints reminiscent of mice and larger webbed tracks that left deep, four-pronged gashes in the earth. Cassandra had adapted, randomizing her route to avoid the predictable patterns of these inhabitants. But today, a sense of unease settled within her. Her recent confrontation with Weslow still echoed in her mind, and his eyes, burning red with anger, haunted her thoughts. It was unlike anything she had experienced before. There were a few tricks to getting by in the forest, and it took more curiosity than caution to figure them out. But even after years of moving through, there was always something new to discover. The smallest kinds of life seemed like a safe place to start when she first became curious, but she didn't expect that so much of her initial trips would be filled with following the lives of tiny blue-striped beetles. She couldn't stand bugs at first, and she'd get upset each time she found them in her hair or clothes, but they never seemed interested or bothered enough to bite her. They surely could, for protruding below their 3 sets of eyes were 2 sharp rows of mandibles, but it didn't take long for her to find out how they survive. For around 4 days a month the rain falls non-stop, making traveling through to town impossible. But after the great storms pass, the flood waters push the town's filth and trash into the forest, where it's broken down by creatures such as the little beetles. Each month they'll eat the garbage or bloated remains of the dead that gets washed in from the city. Within a few days they strip everything off the dead, leaving nothing but bones behind. It was a disturbing sight to be sure, at first. But after she learned that the various animal bones could be used for picking locks, she came to absolutely love the creepy little things. She overheard the older guild members saying that any lock worth picking will be warded against metal tools, but nothing could detect bone. That meant that each month she could collect enough to sell and treat her friends, and as the few dozen bones rattled in her bag, she was eager to meet up with them. Living in the center of the blue forest had moments of great peace, but it also cut Cassandra off from the entire world. She has no one she can speak to, no neighbors to visit, and no food stalls to beg from. But most importantly, her friends could never come here. She needed them in her life, so she wouldn't risk them being hurt. What's more is that they cared about her just as much. They didn't act or talk the same way around her as they did with everyone else, and it wasn't just because she had saved their lives. They always make time for her, they always want to hear about her training at home, the things she discovers in the forest, and to tell her their stories too. One was always in the middle of some silly new problem of gigantic proportions, with Cassandra getting roped in to help. Yet you might be forgiven for thinking that the other brought some manner of caution or maturity to the group, because for the truth of it, 19-year-old Yeslin was in many ways so much worse. A stolen item could be replaced, and sometimes a person may want to see them beaten to a pulp, but Yeslin was a lot trickier when it came to getting what she wants. Though dangerous instances may be rare in comparison, it meant that when Yeslin needed help, things were already really bad. There was probably so much more than what they told her, but Cassandra understands that they have to do things to get by, and they're the sort of things they don't want her anywhere near. Over time, Cassandra found that the blue bugs seemed to respond to her. This took quite a long time to notice, but eventually, they weren't in her hair anymore. At times a large group of them would rise up out of thin air, directly in front of her path, gathering en masse to the point where she would have to find another route through. On more than one occasion she had even gotten lost, only to follow a path of beetles towards where she needed to go. Not back to their nest or back where she came from, but as though they understood her intentions and were doing their best to help. Such behavior didn't extend far beyond little bugs though, and after the sun sets there was nothing that could help. Everything about the forest was hostile at night, down to the scattered red vines that sought to expose anything unnatural to the forest that happened to stop for more than a moment. They illuminate when disturbed in places where the sun cannot reach them, and at night. They were also cutting a path through wouldn't work. They're hard to see, and once severed, every attached section for 3 meters would instantly glow. Even if only for a moment, being exposed so clearly would draw out the worst kind of attention. With the light still piercing through the trees, this would be among the last chances she gets to be still until she reaches the other side of the forest. Squatting down to steady her breathing after her run, she closes her eyes to recall the events of that morning. Weslow reeked of alcohol, and there were some signs that he was recently in a fight. His shirt was torn, with a few dried brown blood stains trailing down his chest. He had some fresh bruises around his eyes and lips too. He got beat up, she whispered aloud. He's so fucking pathetic. It was a regular sight to see him in such a state, then taking his frustrations out on his family, but there were times when everything seemed fine, yet her mother would send her away, sensing something must be off with Weslow. Those times were by far the worst. Her mother had to conceal her injuries with thick makeup or wear layers of clothing to hide the purple swelling from bruises. She never went anywhere to escape, but she would still put on a show as though Cassandra couldn't tell what was wrong. Even so, it would show in Catherine's movements during training. At times she might only use one hand to fend off Cassandra's attacks, or she would forego the quick steps she used to dodge, instead bearing down and pivoting as she blocked and parried. There was no way to comprehend it fully. Her mother had been training her in self-defense since the age of 4, and now, on the cusp of her 10th birthday, Cassandra knew that she herself possessed the strength enough to kill him. Her mother had no reason to endure such abuse, she could certainly overpower Weslow effortlessly. Shaking off her contemplation, Cassandra became acutely aware of the need to press on. There was nothing left for her back home. With renewed determination, she resumed her journey, knowing she had no more than a half-hour's time until she reached the outskirts of the slums. Finally, a glimmer of familiarity emerged, a small stream she had often crossed farther to the north. With a sense of relief, she decided to continue on in this direction. She estimated it would take only another 10 minutes to reach the city. However, as she crossed the stream and ventured no more than a few meters in, her heart sank. A fog was gathering at an alarming rate and the sound of the stream completely disappeared. Even so, with an idea of the direction she has to go, she decides to press on. But once again, found herself stopping before a thin line of beetles. She crouches down and whispers, "I'll deal with whatever it is. I'm in a hurry." At times, this would be plenty for them to allow her passage. She was aware that a possible danger lay ahead, but the morning had left her with little patience for finding a new path forward. "You're getting stronger with each passing day." Her mother's words rang through her mind, and it was enough for her to make her decision final. But more and more beetles gathered, piling on top of each other and raising several inches above the ground. Within a few minutes there would be enough to completely block her path, so she takes the opportunity to hop over them, careful not to harm a single one. She meant to continue onwards, but realizes that her bag was no longer with her. Turning back, she sees it laying atop the mass of beetles. What's more was that she hadn't dropped it at all. The strap that held it in place had been chewed through in the second it took for her to jump over them. "I know you mean well, and thank you. But really, I'll be alright. May I have my bag back?" She reaches her hand for it, but the beetles retreat. Fine, she yells. Take it. But when I take the head of whatever stands in my way, you better give it back. And with that, she moves on, now running without a shred of caution. Her friends would be waiting for her, and that was all that mattered. Should she come face to face with this unknown danger, she would kill it. To Cassandra, it was as simple as that. Chapter 3. Pressing past massive leaves and slipping through tightly packed trees, Cassandra's feet suddenly felt as though they had been kicked out from beneath her. She stumbles forward, all sense of equilibrium lost as she spills down an incline. She touches down hard onto her back, her head hitting hard against a stone that lay just under the mossy surface. Cassandra's head was still spinning as she stood up, the muscles in her back screaming at the effort. As her vision clears, Cassandra's mouth drops open in alarm. She was surrounded by a hazy white fog that poured out from within the very earth, parting to reveal a blood-red lake, stretching out into infinity. Sitting at the water's edge, their feet dangling below the surface, was a boy not much younger than Cassandra. An instinctual urge to call out a warning surged from within, but she immediately clamped both hands over her mouth, muffling any sound. She dropped to her knees, keenly aware of the stillness that enveloped the water's surface. Something was terribly wrong. Ensuring she remained hidden, Cassandra maneuvered side to side, inch by inch, cautious not to disturb the individual vines beneath her feet for too long, until she found better cover. Minutes ticked by in eerie silence, and just as doubt started to seep into her thoughts, the piercing sound of a man's voice shattered the tranquility of the surroundings. It came from across the lake, so Cassandra took that moment to scramble over to the closest tree that could afford her a better and safer view. It didn't take long for the yelling to get closer, the fog seemingly guiding her sight, as the only clarity she could see across the lake was a single spot, where before long, a man, eyes wide with frenzy, appeared yelling, "Please, come back." The fog thickened around the boy at the lake's edge, but at the man's words a new voice emerged. "I'm over here, Dad. Help me, I'm scared." Cassandra's mind reeled in terror. This wasn't right. The voice of the boy emerged through the fog, but the figure at the edge of the lake had still not moved at all. This was a trap, and it wasn't meant for Cassandra. The man, distraught as only a loving parent could be, seized the childlike figure, and his words of comfort come pouring out effortlessly. This man wasn't Weslow, this was a good man. This was over. The water only rose to his waist, but halfway across, the man seemed to struggle. The mud had ripped the shoes off his feet, pulling him by force with every step he takes. He stops for only a moment, his energy draining rapidly. He still calls to the child, still yelling words of comfort. "You'll never have to be scared again, I will get you home safe, I will save you." But he has stopped for too long, and now the vines within the water begin to explode into radiant light. The water begins to swirl around, and from within the whirl emerges the form of a woman, her body dripping the glowing red water of the pond as though it were blood off the fangs of a beast. Cassandra was frozen, her eyes widening in horror. She wanted to scream, but the sound was lost to her as the billowing white cirrocumulus wisps threatened to pull Cassandra in with its force. Within seconds the fog had gathered into a sphere, encapsulating the man and now lifting him above to water to stand at equal height with the creature. "Run!" Every fiber of her being screamed at Cassandra, but she couldn't. The fear had its grip. "Run!" Again the words tore through her mind, but it made no difference. The maddening dance of mist began to rip at the man, slicing away chunks of his flesh as his screams burned into Cassandra. Clasping her hands over her ears did nothing to silence his agony, but the sound was enough to return a fraction of her senses. Looking down, she sees that the red vines had wrapped tightly around her left ankle, and were beginning to give off a light that drew her into the depths of despair. Panic surged through her and her entire body was trembling while the light continues to spread, as if to say, "You're next." She takes the small knife off her leg and managed to quickly cut herself free, not caring in the slightest that she sliced herself in the process. Her last glance back came as a matter of instinct, and what she saw would never fade in its clarity for the rest of her life. The vortex of fog was filled with blood. The man was nothing more than the gore within, save for one thing. The sphere lifts above the creature's form and bursts, its arms stretched above its head in welcome as the blood rains down upon it, and within its hands was the man's heart. Branches whipped at her face, leaving scratches, and every stone and vine caused her to stumble, but she kept running. The screaming in her mind wouldn't stop, forcing her to review the scene over and over. The warmth of the man's voice calling for his child, the screaming, the way the creature seemed so close to her kind, the sound of the blood bursting forth and splashing into the lake. There was no order to what happened, just relentless flashes with increasing clarity for every instance that played on repeat. The man's face agonizingly contorted in pain, the creature's black eyes twisted up into an expression of ecstasy, and now she sees, his heart had still been beating even while the rest was ripped apart. She didn't stop running until she could see the trees returning to the brown that indicated the worst was behind her. She could now feel the wetness of the blood on her face as she touches her cheek, but though the damage wasn't significant, the sight of her own blood returned her to that moment. The damp earthy smell in the air around the lake, the vines with their red glow, and now the blood on her hands, that may not entirely belong to her. With her flight of survival flooding her mind, she had relaxed for only a moment before the memories came flashing back into her reality. Clenching her hand to her mouth, she couldn't stop her body's violent reaction. The vomit pushed through her fingers and the tightness in her stomach forced her to her knees. Releasing the rest of her sickness took the air from every inch of her lungs, and she rolled on the ground, thrashing her filth-covered fingers against her throat, wordlessly pleading for air to return to her. The light begins to fade from her eyes, but she has just enough sense left to hear the only sound she needed. Fuck. Kid. No. What the fuck happened to? And despite the rest of the words fading into oblivion, Cassandra, tears streaking down her face, managed a small smile before losing consciousness.